The carriage that brought Eleanor Ashworth to Thornfield Hall arrived in a thin, cold rain, and no one came out to meet her. She sat for a moment with her gloved hands folded over the worn leather case in her lap, watching the great house rise before her through the streaked window, grey stone, tall windows shuttered like closed eyes. Ivy clinging to the corners as though even the plants had given up trying to soften the place. It was the kind of house that had opinions about who belonged inside it, and Eleanor already suspected she was not one of the people it approved of. She was here for 3 months, perhaps 4, if the housekeeper's letter was to be believed, though housekeepers' letters were often optimistic in ways that reality declined to honor. The previous governess had left without notice. The letter had not explained why, only that the position needed filling at once, that the children were difficult, and that the wages, while modest, would be paid promptly. Eleanor had read that letter 3 times in her aunt's cold parlour, before she had allowed herself to hope it might be true. She was 26, unmarried, and entirely without prospects beyond the ones she made for herself. Her father had died, owing more than he had ever earned. Her mother had followed him within the year, as though grief itself were a debt collector, and Eleanor had learned, in the 2 years since, that dignity was the one possession that could not be repossessed, no matter how empty her purse became. The door of the house did not open for her. She let herself out of the carriage into the rain and climbed the steps alone, her case growing heavier with every stair, and knocked. A young footman answered, looked her up and down with the swift, assessing glance servant's reserve for other servants, and said only, "Round the back, if you please. Mrs. Fenwick will see to you." Eleanor did not flinch, though something in her chest tightened at the words. She had known, in the abstract, that she was coming here as staff, as a governess, a hired thing, a name on a ledger rather than a guest in a drawing room. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and having a door shut gently, apologetically, entirely without malice, directly in her face. She walked round the back. The kitchen entrance was warmer, at least, full of the smell of baking bread and boiling linens, and Mrs. Fenwick, a broad, brisk woman with flour on her forearms and suspicion in her eyes, looked her over with rather more thoroughness than the footman had managed. "You're younger than I expected," Mrs. Fenwick said, which was not quite an insult, though it was not quite not one either. "I am older than I look, and more patient than I appear," Eleanor said, and something in Mrs. Fenwick's face eased, just slightly, at that. "You'll need to be. The last one lasted 6 weeks. Mrs. Fenwick turned and began walking, expecting Eleanor to follow, which she did, up a narrow back stair that smelled of beeswax and old wood. "Master Thomas is 8, and thinks himself much cleverer than he is. Miss Grace is 11, and has decided the whole world is against her, which, given the state of this house, I cannot entirely blame her for." "And the household?" Eleanor asked carefully. "Is there a lady of the house?" Mrs. Fenwick's step slowed, just for a moment. "There was," she said. "The Duchess died 3 years past. Fever, sudden, terrible thing. His Grace has not been." She stopped herself, seemed to reconsider what she had been about to say, and finished instead with, "You'll meet him or you won't. He keeps to the West Wing mostly, the library, the estate books. He is not a man who wants for company, or seems to think he does." Eleanor filed this away. A widower, 3 years grieving, a house run by a housekeeper and 2 frightened children, and said nothing more, because she had already learned that the way to survive in a house like this was to listen far more than one spoke. She was given a small room on the 3rd floor, plain and clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand, and a window that looked out over the stable yard, rather than the gardens. It was, she thought, exactly the room a temporary governess ought to have, comfortable enough to function, plain enough to remind her she was not meant to stay. She did not know. That first rain-soaked evening, unpacking her 3 dresses and her books into a narrow wardrobe, that she was about to become the only person in that entire enormous house who noticed what was actually happening inside it. The grief nobody spoke of, the loneliness nobody named, the 2 children slowly disappearing into silence, and the man at the center of it all, who had built himself a fortress of ledgers and locked doors precisely so that no one would ever again get close enough to leave him. She did not know that by winter he would no longer be able to imagine the house without her in it. She only knew that first night that the house was cold and that nobody had come to meet her, and that she meant to prove herself indispensable before anyone had the chance to decide she wasn't wanted at all. The children, when she met them the following morning, confirmed every fear Mrs. Fenwick's warning had planted. Grace sat at the schoolroom table with her arms crossed and her chin lifted in the particular posture of a child who has decided, long before you arrived, that she will hate you. Thomas would not sit at all. He stood by the window, kicking at the skirting board, refusing to look at Eleanor even when she spoke directly to him. "I understand you've had rather a lot of governesses," Eleanor said, setting her books on the table with deliberate calm. "6, Grace said, with the flat pride of a child cataloguing her victories. "You'll be 7. You won't last either. I might surprise you. You won't." Grace's eyes, when they finally met Eleanor's, were older than 11, weighted with something Eleanor recognized immediately, because she had carried the same weight herself at a much older age than this child now bore it. "Nobody stays here. Not really. Not even Papa." It was such an odd, precise thing for a child to say, "Not even Papa," that Eleanor did not correct her, did not brush past it with false cheer the way the previous governesses evidently had. She simply nodded, as though the observation were reasonable, which, she suspected, it was. "Well," she said instead, "I've nowhere better to be. So you may as well show me what you know, and I'll try not to bore you too terribly while I'm here." It was not charm that won them. In the end she had none to spare, and children could smell false warmth the way dogs could smell fear. It was simply that she did not lie to them. When Thomas got his sums wrong, she told him plainly, and showed him where, and did not pretend the mistake was clever. When Grace refused to read aloud, Eleanor did not cajole. She simply read aloud herself, in a voice low and unhurried, until Grace, despite every effort to appear uninterested, crept closer to see the page. By the end of the first week, Thomas had stopped kicking the skirting board. By the end of the second, Grace had stopped counting governesses. She did not see the Duke at all in those first weeks. He was, as Mrs. Fenwick had promised, a rumour more than a presence. A set of boots heard crossing the hall late at night, a study door that was never open, a place set at the head of the dining table that was, more often than not, left empty, because he had asked for a tray sent up instead. The staff spoke of him the way one speaks of weather that has settled in and shows no sign of breaking, not with fear exactly, but with a kind of resigned deference, as though his silence was simply a condition of the house they had all learned to work around. Eleanor found this, privately, unbearably sad. A father who did not eat with his children. A house of 11-year-old girls and 8-year-old boys learning, slowly and thoroughly, that presence could not be relied upon. She began, without quite deciding to make small repairs to the parts of the household nobody else seemed to have time for. She noticed that Grace's shoes had been too small for a month, and said nothing to the child, only quietly mentioned it to Mrs. Fenwick, who had simply not thought to look. She noticed that Thomas flinched at loud noises and asked, gently, obliquely, until she learned that the fever that had taken the Duchess had come on suddenly, in the night, with shouting and running feet, and a house thrown into a panic the children had never been properly told about, let alone comforted through. She noticed the portrait in the upstairs hall, a woman with Grace's exact eyes, that no one ever mentioned, and that the children walked past every day without looking at. The way one learns not to look directly at the sun. She did not try to fix any of this loudly. She simply began, day by day, to fix what she could, quietly, without asking permission. Because asking permission in this house seemed to be how things went to die in drawers unopened. It was in the third week, on an evening she had not intended to be anywhere near the library, that she first saw him. She had gone down after the children were abbed to fetch a book of poems Grace had asked after. A small thing, an easy kindness. The kind Eleanor had learned mattered more to lonely children than any lesson she could teach them, and she found the library door ajar, firelight spilling into the dark corridor. She should have turned back. She very nearly did. Instead, she saw him before he saw her, a tall man seated at a wide desk, buried in ledgers, his cravat loosened, his dark hair disordered as though he had run his hands through it too many times to count, staring at a column of figures, with the particular blankness of a man who has stopped seeing the numbers entirely, and is looking instead at something no ledger could ever contain. He looked, she thought, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She might have retreated without a sound, but her sleeve caught the edge of a small table in the corridor, and a vase rattled, and his head came up sharply, and there was nowhere left to hide. "Who's there?" he said. Not a question. A demand, low and flat, the voice of a man who did not appreciate being observed unaware. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Eleanor stepped into the doorway rather than skulking in the dark, because there was. She had found no dignity in being caught hiding. "I did not mean to disturb you. I came only for a book." He studied her for a long moment. The plain grey dress, the careful posture, the steadiness with which she met his eyes rather than dropping them, as most of the staff apparently did the moment his temper showed itself. "You are the new governess," he said finally. Not quite a question either. "Eleanor Ashworth, Your Grace." The 7th. "So I am told, though I confess I dislike being counted like inventory." The words were out before she had properly weighed them, and she felt a brief flare of alarm at her own boldness. One did not speak so freely to a duke, particularly not a duke with hollows under his eyes, and a temper the whole staff spoke of in careful whispers. But he did not rise in anger. Something in his expression shifted instead, subtle and unreadable. Something almost like surprise. "No," he said slowly. "I don't suppose you would." He looked back down at his ledgers, and Eleanor understood the audience was over, and she found the book she had come for, Grace's poems, tucked on a low shelf near the door, and left him to his fire and his figures. She did not think he would remember the exchange. She was wrong. The following morning, a small parcel arrived at the schoolroom door, carried by the same young footman who had once directed her round the back without a flicker of courtesy. Inside was a slim volume of poetry, not the one Grace had already borrowed, but another, newer, its spine uncracked. There was no note. There did not need to be one. Eleanor understood, with a small private jolt she chose not to examine too closely, that the Duke had noticed which book his daughter's governess had gone looking for in the dark, and had thought afterward to send another. It was such a small thing. She told herself it was nothing at all. The idle courtesy of a man with more money than attention, tossed off without much thought. And yet she found herself returning to it through the day, the way one returns to touch a bruise simply to confirm it is still tender. She said nothing of it to the children, though Grace, sharp-eyed as ever, noticed the new book among their things and asked where it had come from. "A gift," Eleanor said simply, and left it at that. Life in the house began, slowly, to reshape itself around her presence in ways she had not engineered and could not have predicted. She began taking the children on walks through the gardens in the grey mornings, teaching Thomas the names of the trees his father had once known and never taught him, coaxing Grace into speaking about her mother in small, careful fragments that the girl seemed to need to say aloud to someone who would not flinch or change the subject. She restored, without asking anyone's leave, the old habit of reading aloud after supper, first only to the children, and then, on an evening when the schoolroom fire had gone cold and the drawing rooms had not, in the drawing room itself, where the sound might carry, if anyone cared to listen, down the corridor toward the library. She told herself she was not doing it for him. She was perhaps doing it a little for him. He did not join them, not at first. But Mrs. Fenwick began to remark, with the particular carefulness of a housekeeper unwilling to say too much, that his Grace had taken to leaving his study door ajar in the evenings, where it had been shut for the whole of the past 3 years. "He hears you," Mrs. Fenwick said one afternoon, folding linens with brisk, unhurried hands, not quite looking at Eleanor as she said it. "The reading. He hears it, of an evening." "I'm sure it means nothing," Eleanor said. "I'm sure you believe that," Mrs. Fenwick replied, in a tone that suggested she did not believe it herself. Not for a moment. It was around this time that Eleanor began to understand the particular shape of the Duke's grief, not through anything he told her, for he told her nothing directly, but through the small accumulating evidence of a house built entirely around absence. The Duchess's rooms remained locked, untouched, the key kept by Mrs. Fenwick and never once requested. The portrait in the hall was dusted weekly, but never spoken of. The children's birthdays, she learned from a careless remark of the cook's, had each been marked, for the past 3 years, by a cake and nothing else. No games, no visitors, no father present past the cutting of it, because he could not, it seemed, bear to watch his children grow older in a house their mother would never see them grow up in. Eleanor began, quietly and without permission, to change this too. She organized, for Thomas's 9th birthday, a small gathering, not extravagant, nothing that would draw the disapproving attention of a household unused to celebration, but real. She invited the tenant farmers' boys Thomas had mentioned wistfully more than once, arranged games in the east lawn, convinced Mrs. Fenwick to bake something more interesting than the customary plain cake. She did not ask the Duke's permission. She was not entirely certain, in the moment, that she had the right to arrange such a thing at all. A governess ordering the household about as though it were her own to command, but she had learned by then that in this house, waiting for someone else to act on the children's behalf meant nothing would ever be done. The Duke found her in the garden that afternoon, in the middle of the games, laughing, actually laughing, an unguarded sound she had not permitted herself since arriving, as Thomas triumphantly won a foot race against a boy twice his size in confidence if not in height. She saw him before he spoke, standing at the edge of the lawn in his dark coat, entirely out of place among the running children and the scattered lawn games, watching his son with an expression she could not immediately name. Not anger, not quite grief either, something more complicated, some collision of gratitude and pain that made him look, for just a moment, unbearably young. "You did this," he said, when she came to stand near him, her earlier laughter still warm in her chest. "I hope you don't mind, Your Grace." "I thought," she hesitated, then decided honesty was the only currency she had ever traded in with any success. "I thought a boy ought to have more than cake on his birthday. I did not think it my place to ask, and I apologize if I've overstepped." He was quiet for a long moment, watching Thomas fling himself, breathless and delighted, into a game of tag with the farmer's sons, his hands loose at his sides for once, instead of clenched behind his back, in the stiff, careful posture he wore like a second coat whenever he ventured beyond his study. Eleanor watched him watching his son, and found herself moved by the sight in a way she had not expected. Not pity exactly, for pity would have insulted him, but something gentler and more dangerous, a tenderness that crept up on her unannounced and settled. before she could think better of it. Somewhere close to her heart. "He hasn't laughed like that," the Duke said, "since his mother died." There was nothing in his voice she could safely respond to, no invitation to comfort him, no opening for sympathy he had not asked for, and likely would not welcome. So she said nothing at all, only stood beside him in silence, and let him watch his son be happy, uninterrupted, for as long as he needed to. "Thank you," he said finally, and turned, and walked back toward the house before she could answer, as though he had said more than he had intended to and needed distance to recover his composure. It was, Eleanor thought, watching him go, the first true thing he had said to her since her arrival. It would not be the last. From that afternoon, something in the house shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly to anyone who was not watching closely. But Eleanor was watching closely, because it had become, without her quite admitting it to herself, the thing she thought about most in her quiet hours. The Duke began to appear, occasionally, at the foot of the stairs when the children came down for their morning walk. He began to ask, in brief, almost gruff exchanges in the corridor, how their lessons progressed. Questions Eleanor suspected he had never thought to ask before, because no one had ever given him cause to want the answers. He began, twice in a fortnight, to join them for supper. He said little at the table. He was not a man built for easy conversation, she was coming to understand. His silences were not coldness so much as a kind of permanent bracing, the posture of a man who had learned that softness, once permitted, tended to be taken from him. But he watched his children with an attention that had clearly been absent for a long while, and once, only once, when Grace made a small joke about the housekeeper's cat, Eleanor saw him smile, briefly, almost against his own will, as though the expression had surprised even him. She began to understand, in those weeks, that his reputation in the house, cold, distant, a man who did not want for company, was not quite the truth of him. It was, rather, the armor he had built after losing the one person who had made his own coldness bearable to live inside. He had not stopped wanting company. He had simply stopped believing he deserved to keep it, or that keeping it was safe. It was a dangerous thing to understand about a man so far above her station. She understood it anyway, and could not unknow it. The trouble, when it came, did not come from the Duke at all. It came, as trouble in great houses so often did, from the servants who had the least power, and therefore the most to lose from any shift in the household's order. Sarah, the head housemaid, had served the family since before the Duchess's death, and had watched, with an expression Eleanor had noticed but not fully understood until it was too late, the governess's steady rise in the household's regard. It was Sarah who first murmured, in the servants' hall, that it was strange, wasn't it, how the new governess had wormed her way so thoroughly into a place that had taken the rest of them years to earn. It was Sarah who wondered aloud, where the words might easily be carried upstairs by anyone eager for a bit of gossip, whether a governess ought to be quite so free with the family's private grief, arranging birthdays and reading aloud in drawing rooms as though she owned the place. Eleanor heard the whispers eventually, the way one always does in houses built of thin walls and long corridors. She said nothing in her own defense. She had learned, long before Thornfield Hall, that defending oneself against gossip only fed it further, and that the only real answer to whispered doubt was steady, visible work that spoke for itself. But whispers, left unanswered, have a way of finding fertile ground, and the ground they found, in this case, was Grace. Grace had grown, in the months of Eleanor's tenure, into something closer to the child she might have been, without grief pressing so hard upon her, softer, more willing to laugh, more willing to be comforted. But she had also grown fiercely, jealously protective of the small stability Eleanor represented. And when she overheard, as children in great houses always eventually overhear everything, Sarah's murmured suggestion that the governess was angling for a place far above what she deserved, that she had set her cap, quite plainly, at a duke who was clearly too grief-stricken and too lonely to see what was being done to him. Something in the girl went cold and brittle, in a way Eleanor had thought, hopefully, they had left behind. "Is it true?" Grace demanded, that evening, her arms crossed in the old defensive posture Eleanor had not seen in weeks. "Are you only being kind to us because of Papa?" "Because you want," she stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the accusation, though its shape was plain enough in the room between them. Eleanor felt something in her chest crack, quietly and privately, at the unfairness of it, that the very tenderness she had poured into this child, freely and without calculation, could be so easily twisted by servants' idle cruelty into something transactional and small. "Grace," she knelt, so that she was level with the girl's furious, frightened eyes. "I came to this house as a governess, and nothing more. Whatever I have done, the birthday, the reading, all of it, I did because I care for you and your brother, and because I believed you deserved more happiness than this house had been giving you. That is the whole truth. I promise you that. But people say a great many things, when they've decided in advance not to like someone." Eleanor kept her voice steady, though it cost her something to do it. "I cannot control what is said about me below stairs. I can only tell you the truth, and hope that you know me well enough now to believe it over rumor." Grace searched her face for a long, silent moment. The particular scrutiny of a child who has been disappointed before and is terrified of being disappointed again. And then, slowly, some of the rigidity went out of her shoulders, and she stepped forward and pressed her face, briefly and fiercely, against Eleanor's shoulder. It was a small victory. But it was not. Eleanor understood grimly. The last battle this rumor would demand of her. There were other evenings, in the weeks before the trouble began in earnest, that Eleanor would return to afterward, in her memory, the way one returns to the last warm days before a hard season sets in. There was the afternoon the estate steward came to the house in some agitation over a dispute among the tenant farmers regarding a boundary hedge that had, by all accounts, been quietly encroaching on shared land for a generation, and the Duke, distracted and short-tempered with the burden of it, snapped at the man in a manner unlike his usual careful restraint. Eleanor, present only because she had been walking the children back from the stables and happened to cross the drive at the wrong moment, watched the steward flinch and retreat, and watched the Duke immediately regret the harshness, even as he could not quite bring himself to call the man back and apologize. She did not scold him for it, it was not her place, and she was wise enough to know it. But she mentioned, lightly, over supper that evening, that she had once watched her own father lose a tenant's loyalty, entirely over a single sharp word, spoken in a bad hour, and that it had taken him the better part of 2 years, and considerable humility to win it back. The Duke said nothing in response, but the following morning she learned from Mrs. Fenwick that he had ridden out himself, before breakfast, to speak with the steward directly, and had walked the disputed hedge line personally, and had returned in time for the children's lessons with mud on his boots, and a rare, unguarded satisfaction on his face that Eleanor recognized, with a small private thrill she did not examine too closely, as the look of a man who has done a difficult right thing and found it easier than he expected. There was the evening. Some weeks later, when a sudden autumn storm knocked out the lamps along the east corridor, and Eleanor, checking that the children were settled before the wind grew worse, found the Duke standing alone at the tall window of the gallery, watching the rain lash sideways against the glass, with an expression so distant and so sad that she nearly turned away without speaking. "It was raining like this," he said, without turning, as though he had known she was there before she had made a sound, the night she died. "I have never much cared for storms since." Eleanor did not offer platitudes. She had learned by then That grief of his particular depth did not want comfort so much as company, and so she simply came to stand beside him at the window, close enough that he would know he was not alone in the dark corridor, and said nothing at all until the worst of the wind had passed. "You do not have to fill every silence," he said eventually, something almost like wonder in his voice. "Everyone else in this house rushes to fill it. My aunt, the staff, even my own children sometimes, when they see me looking as I must have looked just now. You simply stay. Silence isn't empty," Eleanor said, "unless you're afraid of what's inside it. I've found more often that it's the only place people tell the truth." He looked at her then, properly, for a long moment in the lamplight, and something passed between them that neither of them named aloud, an understanding, wordless and dangerous, that they had each found in the other something rare enough to be worth the risk of wanting it. "Good night, Miss Ashworth," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual, and turned back toward his study before either of them could say anything further. Eleanor stood alone in the gallery a moment longer, her heart beating with an unfamiliar urgency, and understood, with equal parts hope and alarm, that whatever was growing between them had already gone further than either of them could safely afford to acknowledge in a house so full of watching eyes. There was, too, the matter of the falcon. The Duke kept, in the old mews beyond the stables, a single hunting bird, a fierce, wary peregrine that had belonged, the grooms told her in hushed, half-frightened tones, to the Duchess herself, and that no one, including the Duke, had been able to properly handle since her death. It had grown wild and untrusting in its grief, or so the staff believed, striking at anyone who came too near, refusing the glove, refusing even the Duke's own patient, practiced hand. Eleanor found the bird one grey afternoon while walking the grounds with Grace, who had wandered near the mews out of some old, half-buried memory of her mother, and stood watching in silence as the girl reached, tentative and trembling, toward the wire of the enclosure. "She used to let me hold her glove," Grace whispered. "Before, I don't remember how anymore." The falcon, extraordinarily, did not strike. It watched Grace's small, uncertain hand with an intensity that seemed, to Eleanor, almost mournful, and settled, finally, into something like stillness. It was the Duke who found them there minutes later, drawn by some instinct or some report from a groom, and the sight of his daughter standing quiet and unafraid before the one creature in the household who had, by every account, refused all comfort since his wife's death, stopped him utterly in the doorway of the mews. "She has not done that," he said slowly, "for anyone, not even for me. She simply wanted to be seen," Eleanor said, "rather than managed. I expect that's true of most creatures in grief, Your Grace, birds and people both." He looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded and searching in his face. And Eleanor understood, with a quiet certainty that settled deep and warm beneath her ribs, that whatever he was beginning to feel for her, it was not the passing fascination of a lonely man for a convenient face. It was recognition, the particular, rare recognition of one guarded heart finally sensing, in another, someone capable of sitting patiently outside its walls, without ever once trying to force the gate. It reached the Duke within the week, not through any deliberate cruelty on Sarah's part, but through the simple, careless momentum gossip acquires once set loose in a house with too much silence and too little else to occupy idle minds. He summoned Eleanor to the library on a grey afternoon, and she went with her spine straight and her hands steady, though her heart was not nearly so composed as either. "I am told," he said, without preamble, standing rather than sitting, his back half turned toward the fire, "that there are those in this house who believe you have designs on my regard that exceed your position. I have heard the same, Your Grace." She would not lie to him, nor pretend surprise. "I cannot control what is said of me. I can only tell you it is not true, or rather, that whatever regard I hold for this family I have never once acted from calculation, and never will." He turned to look at her then, and something in his gaze was harder to read than she had yet seen it. Not suspicion, quite, but something adjacent to it. Some old wound of his own being tested. "My wife's family believed, for a time, that she had married me for the title," he said quietly, the words coming as though dragged up from somewhere he rarely visited. "It was not true. But I have learned since that accusations of that kind have a way of poisoning even what is real, if one lets them stand too long unanswered." "Then I am glad you did not let this one stand," Eleanor said. "Though I confess I would understand if my position here has become untenable, it has not." The words came fast, almost sharp, as though he had not intended to say them so plainly, and could not now take them back. He seemed, for a moment, faintly astonished at his own vehemence. Then, more carefully, "My children are happier than they have been in 3 years, Miss Ashworth. I do not intend to sacrifice that happiness to servants' gossip." It was not, she understood, a declaration of anything beyond what he had said. And yet something in the room had shifted regardless. Some acknowledgement, unspoken but unmistakable, that whatever this was between them, he did not wish it to end, because idle voices below stairs had decided to be cruel. She left the library that afternoon steadier than she had entered it, though no less aware of how precarious her position truly was, how easily a house like this could turn, how quickly a governess without family or fortune could be made to disappear if enough people decided she ought to. She did not yet know how close that danger truly was. The Duke's aunt, Lady Ravensworth, arrived at Thornfield Hall in early autumn, uninvited and entirely unannounced, in the manner of a woman who considered every door in her nephew's house to be hers by right of blood. She was tall, sharp-featured, dressed in the severe black she had worn since her own husband's death 2 decades prior. And she possessed, Eleanor understood within moments of their first meeting, the particular talent for cruelty that only the very confident ever fully master. "So," Lady Ravensworth said, looking Eleanor over in the drawing-room with the flat, assessing gaze of a woman inspecting livestock, "you are the governess who has made herself so very indispensable." "I have tried to be of use to the children, my lady." "Of use." The words were repeated with faint, unmistakable mockery. How admirably modest. "And is it also of use to the children, I wonder, that their father has taken to dining with them nightly since your arrival, when he could scarcely be persuaded to sit at his own table for the whole of the past 3 years? Eleanor said nothing, because there was, she understood immediately, no answer that would satisfy a woman who had already decided what conclusion she intended to reach. Lady Ravensworth's campaign, once begun, was neither subtle nor slow. She questioned the servants at length, gathering every whispered rumour Sarah had ever planted and several new ones besides. She remarked, at dinner, in tones pitched precisely to Carrie, on how curious it was that a governess of such humble origins should have acquired such very fine manners, such very confident opinions, such very particular skill at making herself the centre of a household that was not her own. She wondered aloud, more than once, whether it was entirely proper for a young unmarried woman to be so constantly in the company of a grieving widower, whatever the pretence of children between them. The Duke, to his credit, said little in response to his aunt's provocations, but Eleanor noted, with a heaviness she could not fully name, that he said little in her defence either. He seemed in those weeks to withdraw again into the careful distance he had kept before Thomas's birthday, as though his aunt's presence had reminded him of every reason he had once had for building walls in the first place. It was Lady Ravensworth who finally forced the matter, on an evening some 3 weeks into her visit, discovering, or claiming to discover, Eleanor was never entirely certain which, a letter among Eleanor's things that appeared to suggest an understanding between the governess and a footman in a previous household. An old, half-finished correspondence from a life Eleanor had left behind entirely, and thought entirely private. Out of context, stripped of the plain and unremarkable friendship it had actually described. The letter was made to sound like evidence of exactly the kind of scheming, ambitious character Lady Ravensworth had been insisting upon from the start. "I think," Lady Ravensworth announced at dinner, the letter produced with theatrical precision, "that this household has been rather too generous in its trust of a woman about whom we know remarkably little." The accusation landed like a blow. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face, felt every eye in the room turned toward her, the children's frightened, the Duke's unreadable, Lady Ravensworth's triumphant. "That letter," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt, "is from an old acquaintance, and contains nothing improper. I do not know how it came to be removed from my room, my lady. But I would ask that whoever took it explain themselves as thoroughly as you are now asking me to. Are you accusing me of theft?" Lady Ravensworth's voice rose, sharp with outrage. "I am asking a fair question, given that my private correspondence has been read aloud at a dinner table without my consent." The Duke rose then, finally, and the room fell silent at the sound of his chair scraping back. Enough, his voice was quiet, but carried a weight that ended the argument entirely. "Aunt, you will return that letter to Miss Ashworth this evening. Whatever is contained within it is her own affair, and not this family's business to parade at dinner." Lady Ravensworth's face went taut with fury, and something that might have been genuine hurt. "You would take her word over mine? A governess? Over your own family?" "I would take fairness over cruelty," the Duke said, "in my own house, at my own table, regardless of whose word is being weighed." It should have ended there. It did not. Lady Ravensworth left the table that night in cold silence, but she did not leave the house, and within days Eleanor understood that the damage had already been done in quieter ways than a single dinner-table confrontation. Whispers of the letter, half true and wholly distorted, had already begun circulating below stairs and, worse, beyond the estate entirely, carried by visiting tradesmen and departing servants into the village, where reputations, once questioned, rarely recovered their former shape. Mrs. Fenwick came to Eleanor's room one evening, her broad face drawn with an anxiety Eleanor had not seen in her before. "There is talk in the village," Mrs. Fenwick said carefully, "that His Grace's governess has become rather more than a governess ought to be. I do not believe it. Mind, I have watched you with those children for months now, and I know what I have seen. But talk like this has a way of forcing a hand, whether the hand wants forcing or not." Eleanor understood, with a sinking certainty, what Mrs. Fenwick was trying gently to warn her of, that her position, however earned, however honestly held, had become untenable not because of anything she had done, but because of what others had chosen to believe about her, and that a man in the Duke's position, whatever his private feelings, might well decide that protecting his family's name required sacrificing hers. She did not have to wait long to learn whether her fear was justified. The Duke summoned her to the library again, 3 days later, and this time his face carried none of the warmth she had come to associate, cautiously, with their private exchanges. He looked, instead, like a man bracing himself for a duty he did not want to perform. "Miss Ashworth." He did not ask her to sit. "I have given this matter a great deal of thought, and I believe, for the sake of the children, and for the sake of this family's standing, that it may be best if you were to seek a position elsewhere." The words landed exactly as she had feared they might, and yet hearing them spoken aloud, in his own voice, was somehow worse than the anticipation had been. "I understand," she said, because there was nothing else to say, and because she would not beg, would not argue, would not give Lady Ravensworth the satisfaction of watching her plead for a place she had never claimed to want beyond its honest terms. "I will begin making arrangements at once." "Eleanor." He stopped himself, visibly. as though the use of her Christian name had escaped him before he could catch it, and something in his expression cracked, briefly, revealing the man beneath the duty. "This is not. I do not believe the things that have been said of you. I want you to understand that. And yet, you are asking me to leave regardless. I am asking you to leave because I do not know how to protect you from what is being said, short of removing the reason people have found to say it." His voice was rough now, stripped of its usual careful control. "I have watched what your presence has done for my children. I have watched what it has done for this house. I do not wish you gone. I am asking you to go because I do not trust myself to protect you if you stay, and I would rather see you safely placed elsewhere than watch this house destroy you by inches." It was, in its way, the most honest thing he had ever said to her, an admission, not of indifference, but of a fear so large he could not see past it to any other solution. And it was. Eleanor understood with a bitter clarity exactly the kind of quiet, well-intentioned cowardice that had allowed a woman like Lady Ravensworth to win. "Then I hope, Your Grace," she said with as much composure as she could summon, "that you find someone willing to protect your children's happiness as thoroughly as you protect this family's reputation." She left the library without waiting for his answer, and did not look back to see what remained on his face. She was gone within the week, not dismissed publicly, for the Duke had at least the decency to arrange her departure with a generous reference and a settlement she had not asked for, and did not entirely wish to accept. But gone regardless, her narrow room on the 3rd floor stripped bare. Her case packed once more, the house exactly as cold and unwelcoming on her final morning as it had been on her first. Grace cried at the carriage door, in a way that broke something loose in Eleanor's careful composure. Thomas said nothing at all, only stood very still with his hands clenched at his sides, as though refusing to cry were the last defense he had left. The Duke did not come down to see her off. Eleanor told herself, all the long cold miles back toward her aunt's house in the city, that this was simply what happened to women in her position, that hope, once permitted to take root in a heart as guarded as hers, had always been a foolish indulgence, and that she ought to have known better than to let herself believe, even briefly, that a house like Thornfield Hall could ever truly belong to someone like her. She did not yet know that the house, in her absence, had already begun to fall apart. It began, in the weeks after her departure, with small things, the kind of small things that accumulate, in a house already fragile, into something no one can any longer ignore. Thomas stopped speaking at meals. Grace refused her lessons with the replacement governess Lady Ravensworth hastily engaged, a stiff, competent woman who taught Latin declensions with great precision and no warmth whatsoever. The reading in the drawing-room stopped entirely, because no one else in the household thought or dared to begin it again. The Duke noticed all of this with the slow, sickening clarity of a man watching a wound reopen that he himself had allowed to be inflicted. He found himself, in the evenings, standing outside the drawing-room where Eleanor's voice used to carry, listening to nothing but silence, and understanding, with each passing night, exactly how much silence had cost his family before, and exactly how much it was costing them again now. It was Mrs. Fenwick, in the end, who said aloud what everyone in the house had already begun to feel. "This house was breathing again, Your Grace," she said one evening, with the particular boldness of a servant who has decided that loyalty sometimes requires speaking plainly, regardless of consequence. For the first time since the Duchess passed, it was breathing. "And you let your aunt's spite talk you into cutting off its air. I did what I believed necessary to protect her," the Duke said, though even as he said it, the words sounded thinner than they had in the library, thinner than they had felt at the moment he'd spoken them to Eleanor's steady, wounded face. "You did what was easiest, Mrs. Fenwick said, not unkindly, but without softening the truth of it either. There's a difference, sir, between protecting a person and protecting yourself from the trouble of standing beside them. I have known you since you were a boy climbing that oak in the west lawn. I do not think you have ever once, in all that time, chosen the easy path when the right one was harder. I would ask you not to start now. It was Lady Ravensworth herself, unexpectedly, who provided the final piece of clarity he needed, though not in any manner she would have chosen. A letter arrived at the house some weeks later, from a former lady's maid dismissed from Lady Ravensworth's own household years prior, detailing with cold, precise fury how the old letter used against Eleanor had in fact been obtained through deliberate searching of the governess's private room, undertaken at Lady Ravensworth's own direction, and how its contents had been selectively read aloud specifically to create the impression of scandal where none existed. The maid, it seemed, had kept the truth to herself out of fear for years, until conscience, or perhaps simple spite toward a mistress who had dismissed her without cause, finally loosened her tongue. The Duke read the letter twice, standing in his library with the fire gone cold beside him, and felt something in his chest collapse entirely, not merely guilt, though there was plenty of that, but a clean, furious understanding of exactly how thoroughly he had failed the one person in 3 years who had asked nothing of him but honesty, and given him, in return, more of it than he had known how to receive. He did not send a letter. He did not send an intermediary. He ordered his carriage that same night, in defiance of the late hour and his aunt's outraged protests, and set out for the city himself. He found Eleanor's aunt's house 2 days later, a narrow, unremarkable building on a narrow, unremarkable street, entirely unlike the grand hall he had kept her confined within for so many months, without ever quite admitting to himself what her presence there had come to mean. Eleanor answered the door herself. The household, he understood at a glance, could not afford a servant to do it for her, and the shock on her face at finding him standing on her doorstep, travel-worn and unannounced, gave way swiftly to something far more guarded. "Your Grace." Her voice was cool, controlled, the voice of a woman who had spent the past weeks rebuilding walls he had taught her, painfully, she needed. "I did not expect you. I have come to apologize," he said, "though I understand apology alone cannot undo what I allowed to happen to you." "No," she agreed. "It cannot." "I have proof now," he pressed on, though her coolness cost him more than he let show, "that the letter was stolen from your room deliberately, and its contents distorted for exactly the purpose of driving you out. I have dismissed my aunt from Thornfield Hall entirely. I have made certain the truth is known, in the village and in the house both, that you did nothing wrong, that the wrong was entirely mine, in believing, even for a moment, that protecting my family's name was worth more than protecting the woman who had given that family its happiness back." Something in Eleanor's careful composure wavered, though she did not yet let it fully break. "You sent me away," she said quietly. "Not your aunt. You, I know." He did not look away from the accusation, though it clearly cost him to hold still beneath it. "I told myself I was protecting you. I understand now that I was protecting myself, from the risk of caring for you as openly as I had already begun to, and from the fear of losing you the way I lost my wife, if I let myself claim you fully, and something happened regardless. It was cowardice dressed as caution, and you paid the price for it. I have no right to ask your forgiveness. I have come anyway, because the alternative, living the rest of my life having let you go without at least telling you the truth, was no longer a thing I could bear." The street was quiet around them, the afternoon light thin and grey, entirely unremarkable for the kind of moment it was becoming. "The children," Eleanor said finally, her voice unsteady now in a way it had not been a moment before. "How are they?" "Grieving you," he said honestly, "as though they have lost a mother twice. Thomas has not laughed since you left." Grace asks after you daily, and I have no honest answer to give her beyond the truth, which is that I sent you away, and do not know if you will ever consent to return." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, and he made himself hold still through it, understanding that whatever answer she gave him now, he had earned no right to hurry her toward it. "I did not leave that house because I stopped caring for those children," she said at last. "Or because I stopped." She stopped herself, the way he so often had, and he saw, with a rush of something he did not dare yet name hope, that she was fighting the same battle against her own guarded heart that he had spent 3 years losing to grief. "I left because you asked me to, and because I believed, in that moment, that you meant it." "I did not mean it," he said. "I have never regretted anything so completely in my life." "Then say plainly what you have come here to ask," she said, "because I find I no longer have the patience for half-spoken things, Your Grace. Not from you, not after everything this house has already cost me." He crossed the small distance between them on her narrow doorstep, and for the first time since she had known him, his voice held nothing guarded in it at all. "I am asking you to come home," he said, "not as a governess, as the woman I have come, entirely against my own better caution, to love, steadily, completely, and without any further cowardice on my part. I am asking you to marry me, Eleanor, and to let me spend whatever years I am given proving that I have learned, finally, the difference between protecting someone and standing beside them." She did not answer at once. She let the silence stretch, not out of cruelty, but because she needed, after everything, to be certain the words she was hearing were as solid as they sounded. "You understand what will be said," she said finally. "A duke marrying his children's former governess. The scandal will follow us both." "Let it," he said. "I have spent 3 years hiding behind a locked study door, because I was afraid of what people might say, what I might lose, what grief might do to me a second time if I let anyone close enough to matter. I am done being ruled by that fear. I would rather face every drawing room in England at your side than spend one more evening in that house, listening to the silence you left behind." Eleanor felt something in her chest, some last careful wall she had built in the weeks since leaving Thornfield Hall, finally give way entirely. "Then yes," she said, and the word came out steadier than she expected, steady with the particular certainty of a woman who has weighed a risk fully and chosen it anyway. "Yes, Your Grace, I will come home." He took her hands then, there on the narrow doorstep of an unremarkable street, and for the first time in 3 years, the Duke of Thornfield allowed himself, entirely without armor, to simply be glad. They returned to Thornfield Hall together a week later, in a carriage that arrived not in cold rain this time, but in the pale, clear light of early winter, and the children, warned in advance by a letter their father had labored over more carefully than any ledger he had ever kept, were waiting on the front steps when the carriage drew up the drive. Grace did not wait for the door to be opened for her. She ran, skirts flying, and threw herself against Eleanor before either foot had properly touched the ground, and Thomas, more carefully but no less fiercely, followed close behind. Mrs. Fenwick stood in the doorway, arms crossed, trying and entirely failing to hide the fact that she was crying. "Well," she said, when Eleanor finally reached the top of the steps, "it took the 2 of you long enough." They were married in the small village church that had stood beside the estate for 2 centuries, in a ceremony far quieter than the Duke's rank might have demanded, and far warmer than the house had known in years. Lady Ravensworth was not in attendance. The village, whatever whispers had once circulated, turned out in surprising numbers to see the wedding of a governess who had, in the space of a single year, quietly and thoroughly become beloved by everyone who had actually taken the trouble to know her. That winter, for the first time since the Duchess's death, the fires in every room of Thornfield Hall were lit before dusk, rather than after. The library door stood open more evenings than not. The drawing-room filled, once more, with the sound of reading aloud after supper, though now the Duke himself sometimes took the book from Eleanor's hands and read a chapter in his low, careful voice, while his children curled against his sides, and his wife watched from the settee with a contentment she had never once, in all her years of careful survival, allowed herself to expect. The portrait in the upstairs hall was, at last, spoken of again gently, without pain, as the children began to ask their new mother questions about the woman who had come before her, and Eleanor answered each one with a patience and honesty that honored rather than erased what had been lost. And on the first snow of that winter, watching from the library window as Thomas and Grace built something lopsided and delighted in the white expanse of the east lawn, the Duke drew his wife close against him and pressed a kiss to her temple, and said quietly the words that had taken him 3 long years and 1 nearly catastrophic mistake to finally understand. I did not know, when you arrived soaked through and entirely unwelcomed, that you would become the center this whole house had been missing. I know it now. I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never doubt it. Eleanor turned in his arms, the fire warm at her back, the snow falling soft and silent beyond the glass, and understood, with the deep, settled certainty of a woman who had finally found the place she was meant to stay, that whatever storms had brought her to this house, whatever cruelty had nearly driven her from it, she had, at last, come home. Later that same winter, on a morning bright and sharp with frost, Grace came running across the east lawn with something small and fierce perched, trembling but steady. Upon a leather glove far too large for her hand, the old falcon, coaxed back at last into something like trust, carried out from the muse for the first time in 3 years by a girl who had learned, from the woman now standing at the window beside her father, that patience was its own kind of love. She let me carry her all the way from the stables, Grace called up, breathless with pride. All the way, Papa, she didn't strike once. The Duke watched his daughter cross the frost-bright lawn with the bird held steady and sure upon her glove, and felt his wife's hand slip quietly into his own. It seems, he said softly, this house has learned, at last, how to hold what it loves without frightening it away. Eleanor smiled, watching Thomas dash out to join his sister, watching the falcon settle, calm and unafraid, upon the glove of a child who had once flinched at every loud sound in this house, and now ran laughing across its lawns, without a single shadow trailing behind her. It only needed someone willing to stay long enough to prove it was safe, she said. He turned from the window and drew her close, and outside the glass the snow began, softly, to fall again, not the cold, unwelcoming rain that had brought her to this house a year before, but something gentler, something settling quietly over the gardens and the stables and the mews and the whole wide waiting estate, as though the house itself, having finally remembered how to breathe, had decided at last to rest. Thornfield Hall, that winter, was no longer a house of locked doors and empty chairs. It was a house of open fires and reading aloud after supper, of children's laughter carrying down corridors that had once held nothing but silence, of a falcon returned to a gentle hand and a portrait spoken of with love, rather than avoided with grief, of a Duke who had learned, finally and completely, the difference between guarding his heart and living inside it, and at the center of it all, exactly where she had never once expected to belong, stood the woman who had come to Thornfield Hall only as a temporary governess, and had stayed to become the very heart the house had been quietly waiting, through all its cold and silent years, to find.